How the hell did we get here? Just to note, I practically made this entire video, and then Israel Adesanya goes ahead and announces that he's no longer going to fight Dricus du Plessis for the next title defense. He's going to fight Sean Strickland, though unless Sean Strickland pulls off the miracle and becomes the people's champ, I do think that Israel Adesanya at some point is going to defend his title against Dricus du Plessis. Anyways, here's the video. After UFC 290, Dricus du Plessis versus Israel Adesanya is now a very possible fight to make, which is absolutely unbelievable considering no one even thought that Dricus would win over Robert Whittaker, let alone have a possible title shot with Izzy. I remember everybody saying that Robert Whittaker would win this fight by whatever he wants, and du Plessis even came into this fight a plus 300 underdog. Fast forward a couple days later, du Plessis not only knocks out Robert Whittaker, but legitimately dominated him throughout this fight. But what was even stranger was his next fight that same night. A strange verbal altercation with Israel Adesanya where Izzy, extremely shit-faced, called du Plessis his African brother and proceeded to spam the N-word. This would cause a lot of fans to call this very cringy, and even Dricus would call Israel Adesanya very childish for his behavior. But what caused such a weird, cringy outburst from Izzy? So let's go back 4-ish months, when this infamous clip of du Plessis goes viral and spreads like wildfire. In this interview, du Plessis calls out Kamaru Usman, Israel Adesanya, and Francis Ngannou, claiming that the belt has never truly gone back to Africa, as when those guys won, the belt either went back to America or New Zealand, the places they moved to and trained in, and continued saying that he would be the first African residing champ to truly bring back the belt to Africa, as he is the only fighter out of those guys that lives, trains, and breathes in Africa. And obviously this sparked a lot of opinions and controversies, as some people were backing up du Plessis, saying that he is the only one out of the group of African-born fighters to continually train in Africa, with Francis and Kamaru training in the US and Israel Adesanya training in New Zealand. And of course, some people were against Dricus, bringing up things like race and saying that he isn't truly African because of the color of his skin. But obviously the biggest response was from Israel Adesanya, who had this same sentiment. In an interview in response to Dricus, Izzy went on the offensive, basically saying that who is du Plessis to tell him what he is, saying things like you can take the boy out of Africa, but you can't take the Africa out of the boy, in response to claims that he is less African for growing up a majority of his life in New Zealand after moving from Nigeria. This would lead to another response, this time from du Plessis on Ariel Helwani's show. Du Plessis would try to clear up the air, saying that he didn't try to call anyone less African, and he didn't try to call himself more African than those guys. He simply wanted to represent Africa by being the first guy to get the belt by residing in Africa. He also tried to clear up the air by saying this has nothing to do with skin color, and simply he just wants to be the first residing African champion, which is a good point, as Kamaru, Izzy, and even Francis all moved out of Africa and achieved championship status training outside of Africa. Now, all of this controversy would also bring up Izzy's history of moving from country to country and changing who he represented. Israel Adesanya was born in Nigeria, but at the age of 10 moved to New Zealand and grew up a majority of his life there, and even briefly moved to China and also represented China when he was fighting in kickboxing, and finally came back to New Zealand, where he has since resided. And despite representing African, Kiwi, and even Chinese people while moving around and living in different countries, Izzy still called out Robert Whittaker for not being a real Kiwi, for him being born in New Zealand and being of Maori descent, but residing in Australia a majority of his life. And of course, fans would be quick to call out the hypocrisy of representing multiple countries while residing in a different country and then calling out somebody else for doing the exact same thing. And I can't find the comment, but somebody said online that Izzy changes the countries he represents so much, he should change his name to Palestine Adesanya, which in my opinion is the KO of the year. Anyways, this is where the story should have ended. A small beef over who was truly African, and that's it. Because at the time, Izzy had just beaten Alex Pereira and basically cleared out the division, beating the only guy who beat him at 185. Meanwhile, no one thought that Dricus would even be in the conversation of belt contention before UFC 290 and his fight against Robert Whittaker. Dricus, before Whittaker, was the 6th ranked middleweight and was far from getting a title shot, though was and still is undefeated in the UFC and has had some highlight wins over Darren Till and Derek Brunson. But in those fights, he showed why he was far from getting a title shot because of his one major hole in his game, his gas tank. Dricus in those fights gassed bad. Even though he beat Darren Till bad in the first round, he clearly gassed out in the second round and let Darren Till catch up and beat him up in the second, before eventually moving on to the third round, getting the fight to the ground and securing Darren Till's back and getting the neck crank for the win. And Dricus in his fight against Brunson clearly gassed out in this fight in the first round, and again was very tired in the second round with his mouth wide open, though he was still able to throw bombs. Eventually, at the end of this round, Dricus would drop Brunson with a big right hand and end the fight there. So apparently the reason why Dricus gasses out in his fights so bad is because of his nose. According to his coach, Dricus' nose was only getting 8% of oxygen and was still finishing opponents despite such a big disadvantage. Many people were skeptical of this claim, considering that this is an insanely low percentage of oxygen and huge disadvantage to be willing to fight at in the UFC, but it turned out to be true, because before his fight against Robert Whittaker, Dricus would get his nose surgery he'd been waiting for and absolutely showed the difference in his performance. Du Plessis came out strong in this fight, keeping up with Robert Whittaker's striking and pace, and eventually took down Robert Whittaker and bloodied him at the end of the first. Dricus would also carry this momentum in the second round and surprisingly drop Robert with a jab from the southpaw stance and just pummel him with punches, backing up Robert to the cage and eventually finishing him there. He absolutely proved everyone wrong, as not only did he win this fight, the KO wasn't lucky. The entire fight was pure domination. He didn't win off a puncher's chance. Du Plessis legitimately dominated Robert Whittaker, the former champ, and destroyed him in the second round, proving he was a true threat to the belt. And in this fight, he was able to show that the nose surgery did have an impact on his endurance, and also showed the diversity of his attacks by showcasing his striking, takedowns, and ground and pound. And with that, Dricus would shock the world and we'd come back to where we started. Now the real question is, how much of a threat is Dricus du Plessis to Izzy and his status of champion? I think after the Robert Whittaker fight, Dricus is at the very least a legitimate title contender and definitely deserves to be next in line for Israel Adesanya. He has shown that with a clear nose, he can throw bombs with good technique and can even mix it up with takedowns and ground and pound. From the Robert Whittaker and even Darren Till fights, he's shown that he can utilize this skill very well to force guys to the ground, and he can definitely, in my opinion, do the same thing to Israel Adesanya. So in summary, he isn't some up-and-coming brawler that Izzy's going to pick apart. He's a strong, smart, and even well-rounded fighter that is good at things Izzy has lost to. He is an accurate power puncher, and now with a clear nose, can probably keep up that accuracy and form for extended periods of time. He's also a very strong, stocky guy that can mix up takedowns well with his striking and keep guys on the ground by utilizing his strength. Ultimately, I'm super happy that Dricus got that win, because it seemed like Izzy had no competition. He had cleared out the top 5 of his division, and had Robert won against Dricus, it would have been same old, same old. Now, Dricus du Plessis provides a legitimate threat for Israel Adesanya, and with their history of their back and forth over who is truly African, this could set up the first UFC event in Africa and make for an even bigger event. So what do you guys think? Is Dricus a legitimate threat to Israel Adesanya, and can he win and become the first quote-unquote African champ, real African champ? Or will Israel Adesanya pick this guy apart and stay champ for a very long time? Anyways, thank you guys for all your support, and I'll see you next week. Peace.